Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jack. Sandy, could you hand me my water? Thank you. I'll probably need this. Well, I want to welcome everybody. It's a beautiful day here, and welcome everybody on the Cybercast stream and on the phone hookup. So today, we're at the fifth Sabbath since the wave sheaf offering during the days of unleavened bread. At the end of the seventh Sabbath, beginning on the first day of the week, we will celebrate the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks or the Feast of Pentecost. Today I want to draw your attention to the fact that we are observing each of the holy day observances on the same days of the week as they did the year of the Exodus. I do not know how often that has happened over the decades or the centuries or even the millenniums, but it is happening this year. One other year that it happened was AD 30. That's the year that Christ was crucified. The first 7 months of the ecclesiastical year of the Exodus of the year of Christ's sacrifice matches the same dates and days of the week as those that we are experiencing this year. Because of that, we might feel a bond of unity with the Israelites as they were exiting. Most of them were stubborn and stiff-necked. They constantly rebelled and rejected God. They saw mighty miracles and signs, yet most could not bring themselves to trust and obey God. Most of us struggle with the same emotions and the same doubts. For us, hopefully, with the help of God's Holy Spirit, we are able to overcome our stubbornness and doubts and fears. With God's help, we are learning faith in God and developing our own faithfulness, with the hope of being born again into the family of God. My title today is 54 Days of the Exodus. In this message, I hope to maintain 3 different counts. One will be the number of days the Israelites were on their journey out of Egypt. Second, we will maintain a count for from the wave sheaf offering to Pentecost. And third, in keeping with my title, we will be counting the days from Passover, because that's part of the process of them exiting Egypt. The count of 50 days from the wave sheaf offering will not begin until 3 days later on their 4th day of travel. The wave sheaf count will be 3 days less than their travel time. Because I want to include Passover, you can just add 1 day to the travel time to understand my title. In the year of the Exodus, for the descendants of Jacob, slaves in Egypt, Passover began on Tuesday evening after sunset. It's the same as it did this year for us. This year, 2026, we are in the same week pattern that existed between the days of unleavened bread and Pentecost, when Israel traveled out of Egypt to the promised land. From the account in Exodus, we can determine which days of the week many events occurred in the year of the Exodus. Today, I want to start off by doing that. I hope to demonstrate to your satisfaction with the study of relative timing of historic events can be accurately determined. The Bible contains information that confirms the accuracy and the legitimacy of the Hebrew calendar as the framework within which God established and commanded his annual holy days and commanded assemblies to be commemorated. One reason for confirming dates and times is to provide evidence and thereby proof of the accuracy of the Bible accounts along with the authenticity of the calendar in 3 aspects. As a historic framework, a framework for scheduling our activities, and a framework for predicting future events. These can only be accomplished through diligently searching the Scriptures. The process will help settle in the mind of each one of us that God is consistent. As we mature and we grow our confidence and trust in God, as we grow in our confidence and trust in God, we will understand him and his ways much better. We must learn to think and analyze in the same way that God does. When we do, he becomes more predictable to us. His ways will become easier for us to understand. If you turn to Exodus 12, and I'm using the New King James Version, this chapter is the place where the initial timing and start of the holy day calendar for Israel was established. Always remember, the ecclesiastical calendar year is a subset of the Hebrew civil calendar. The Hebrew civil calendar establishes the timing of each month and the length of and number of days contained in each year. The ecclesiastical or holy day calendar year starts in a specific month of the already existing Hebrew civil calendar. The framework of the Hebrew calendar is established based on the civil calendar. The civil calendar starts on the first day of Tishri. Tishri is the 7th month of the ecclesiastical calendar. The ecclesiastical calendar starts on the first day of Abib. In the calendar, in the Bible, the month of Abib is also called Nisan. Exodus 12, verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. First, notice who is speaking. Jehovah is speaking directly to Moses and Aaron. Clearly, Moses and Aaron heard Jehovah speak to them while they were in Egypt. I have never heard God speak, and I suspect that none of you probably have either. God's instruction was that the month that they were currently in was to be the first month of Abib. In the year Israel left Egypt was Thursday, the first day of the week of that month. The Sabbath that week was on the 3rd of Abib, or Nisan. I do not know which day of the month that God spoke to Moses and Aaron. As we will see in verse 3, we do know that he spoke to them before the 10th day of the month of Abib. Continuing in verse 3. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. In the year of the Exodus, the 10th day of the month was a Sabbath. Continuing in verse 6. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts and on the lintels of the house where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Which night? The night of the 14th, which fell on Wednesday in the year of the Exodus. That means Passover 24. The Passover 24-hour day began after sunset Tuesday evening and ended on sunset on Wednesday evening. Wednesday evening at sunset was the next day, the 15th. So you had the 14th, the 15th. This is exactly the same sequence and on the same timing that we did this year, and the same time we observed our festivals. Continuing in verse 28. Verse 28. Chapter 12 of Exodus. Then the children of Israel went away and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all of his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. The events on that Tuesday evening after sunset began with the slaying of the lamb, putting the blood on the doorposts, roasting the lamb, and then eating the lamb. It takes a while to roast a lamb, I think about 2 or 3 hours. We know they ate the lamb during the night hours of the 14th of Abib. In the middle of that night, Jehovah killed the firstborn of all those that were not protected by the blood. After the firstborn of the land were killed, while it was still night, Pharaoh and all the Egyptians were awake and very distraught. And hold your place here in Exodus. We'll be coming back. Turn to Numbers 33. Numbers 33, and we'll start in verse 3. It says, they departed from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the day after the Passover. We've already seen the Passover was on the 14th. The children of Israel went out with boldness in the sight of all the Egyptians. Notice the differentiation between the day of Passover and the day Israel left Ramesses in Egypt. The Passover was on the 14th, and they left the next day, the 15th of the month. Back to Exodus 12. So how important is this Passover event on the 14th day of the month of Abib? Exodus 12:24. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. Skipping down to 26. And it shall be when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? That you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Observance of Passover as a commanded memorial at the beginning of the 14th of Abib each year is a permanent requirement that will be required forever. The lamb symbolizes the sacrifice of Christ on the cross for our sins. Christ updated the symbols to be observed at the beginning of the 14th, and as we covered in a previous sermon, the new Passover symbols were part of a pattern that occurred on the 14th and 15th of Abib, exactly 430 years earlier, prior to the Exodus. Skipping down to verse 40. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. Verse 41. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And it is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night that the Lord, this is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. This night of solemn observance is a separate observance from the commanded observance of Passover. The observance represents Jehovah's deliverance of his people from the bondage of slavery and oppression under the rule of the Egyptians. For us today, those who have God's Holy Spirit dwelling within us, the night represents our deliverance from the bondage and the penalty of sin. And that penalty is death. In the year of the Exodus, the 15th of Abib, happened on Thursday of that year. The weekly Sabbath was on the 17th, so if you'll skip back to verse 37. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them, and flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock. From my research, it seems that the location of Succoth is unknown. There are varying accounts of how far the distance from the Ramesses to Succoth might be. Estimates range from 30 to 85 miles. Friday would have been around the second day of the journey, the third day of the Sabbath, and the events described in the first part of chapter 13 seem to be applicable to what would happen on the Sabbath. Continuing in chapter 13, verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and beast, it is mine. This is not the type of activity that would be likely conducted while they were on the move. What makes sense is that they paused in their travels for the Sabbath and likely stayed at least part of Sunday. The theme indicates that they were still in the days of unleavened bread. Redeeming the firstborn also ties in with the theme of the wave sheaf offering. What is being redeemed by the sacrifice of a lamb on the day of the wave sheaf is in part the firstborn, and then much more. Skipping to verse 11. And it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to your fathers and to you and your fathers, and gives it to you, that you shall set apart to the Lord all that opens the womb, that is, every firstborn that comes from an animal which you have, the males shall be the Lord's. But every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, and if you will not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And all the firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. Now we are going to see what is the point of this. Verse 14. So it shall be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, What is this? That you shall say to him, By strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Verse 15. And it came to pass when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore, I sacrifice to the Lord all males that open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. Redeeming the firstborn by sacrifice was done to memorialize Jehovah's supreme power over life and death. God has supreme power over all the nations. He is supreme over everything, including life. The children of Israel were being taught through the redemption of their firstborn that the privilege of life has value. The privilege of life should not be taken for granted. Verse 16, It shall be a sign on your hand and as frontlets between your eyes, for by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. The next day after the weekly Sabbath during unleavened bread was the wave sheaf offering. If you turn over to Leviticus 23. The process of offering a sacrifice as a price for redemption indicates that life is precious. Leviticus 23 gives us a little more information about the wave sheaf offering. This ceremony is still within the days of unleavened bread. This is day 4, counting from the beginning of the Exodus on the 15th day of the month of Abib. Leviticus 23, and we'll begin in verse 9. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Redeeming a person or a thing requires that whatever is being offered as the redeeming price must be acceptable as valuable compensation. The sheaf represents that the sacrifice is accepted. We might ask, what was offered for the price of redemption? For that, we continue in verse 12. Verse 12, and you shall offer on that day when you wave the sheaf a male lamb of the first year without blemish as a burnt offering to the Lord. What was being offered was a perfect life. a lamb without blemish. As you know, the wave sheaf offering represents Christ's sacrifice of his perfect life. His life was offered as an exchange for the redemption of everything held in bondage because of sin. That included everything that has or will ever be created. Because of sin, everything that was created was under the penalty of sin. The penalty of sin, of course, is death or destruction. That includes all other spirit beings that are part of the creation. Christ did not redeem himself. God the Father, Almighty God, the Supreme God, Jehovah, chose to resurrect him from the dead and give him his life back. After his life was returned to him, he presented himself before God, and his sacrifice was accepted as a reasonable value for the redemption of everything that was created. A perfect life has great value. The children of Israel were given 4 things to remember. 1, the Passover as a memorial for the sacrifice is required for deliverance from the bondage of sin. 2, the night of solemn observance represented God's strength in delivering those he chose to deliver. Number 3, redeeming the firstborn from God reveals that something of value is required for anything redeemed. Life is precious. And 4, the wave sheaf memorializes that what is offered as a price must be acceptable. A perfect life, a lamb without blemish, was required, offered, and accepted. Continuing in verse 15 of Leviticus 23. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day of the 7th Sabbath, then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. From Sunday during the days of unleavened bread, the count to Pentecost begins. There is always only one Sunday during the days of unleavened bread. The wave sheaf offering and Pentecost are permanently tethered by the count of 50 days. I suspect they traveled Monday and Tuesday, which would have been days 2 and 3 of the count to Pentecost, or by counting travel days 5 and 6 of their travel out of Egypt. The next day, day 7 of their travel, was Wednesday, the last day of unleavened bread and an annual Sabbath. Turn back to Exodus 13. We can assume they stopped again and kept the Sabbath on Wednesday. 3 days later would have been the first weekly Sabbath after the wave sheaf Sunday. The first weekly Sabbath after the wave sheaf offering was day 10 of their travel, day 7 of the count to Pentecost, and when we add in Pentecost, day 11 for my count of Exodus for my title. Exodus 13, and I want to begin in verse 20. So they took their journey from Succoth and camped in Etham at the edge of the wilderness. Recent archaeological research studies have shown that Israel would have crossed the Red Sea from the eastern coast of the Sinai through the Gulf of Aqaba. Their travels from Succoth to Etham would have taken them near the southern tip of Sinai and up the eastern coast of the Sinai. Continuing in verse 1 of chapter 14, now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea. According to AI Overview, Migdol or Migdal means tower, fortress, or watchtower. In my research, I found a website called Bible.ca that claims the Migdal referenced here was a watchtower on the high hills near the southern end of Sinai. That'd be the Sinai Peninsula. God had led them further north along the Sinai, let them camp, and then brought them south back to the point where the watchmen in Migdal would see the camped Israelites near the sea and send word to Pharaoh that the Hebrew slaves were wandering around in a trap, and it had wandered into a trap. Baal Zephon was in Arabia, which is across the Red Sea from the Sinai Peninsula, east of the Gulf of Aqaba. Continuing in verse 3, Exodus 14:3, for Pharaoh will say to the children of Israel, they are bewildered by the land, and the wilderness has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. I think we all know the story. God lured Pharaoh into attempting to destroy or recapture the Hebrew slaves. God saved them by parting the Red Sea, allowing Israel to cross into what is now Saudi Arabia, then luring the Egyptians into the sea and destroying them by closing the waters back over them. This likely happened on Sunday, ER 9, Exodus 14, verse 30. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the land of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. So the results was that their hearts were full of joy and thankfulness. So let's look at chapter 15, verse 1, just continuing on. Then Moses and the children sang this song to the Lord and spoke, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. Unfortunately, the thrill and appreciation of what God had done for them was short-lived. God tested their attitude, and we get a negative response. So Moses brought verse 22 of Exodus 15. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and then they went out from the wilderness of Shur. They went out 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And verse 24, and the people complained against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? God was testing their faithfulness. Would they be faithful even when life was difficult or when they were afraid? Exodus 15, verse 27. And then they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees. So they camped there by the waters. So if you turn over to Exodus 16, you may be wondering why I have been able to tell you with certainty which days of the week each of these events happened in the year of the Exodus. The reason is that the biblical account references events in terms of the calendar. From the reference points given, a person familiar with the calendar can easily determine what day of the week an event occurred, and in this case, the exact timing of the holy days that year. Exodus 16, verse 1. Verse 1, and they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. And on the 15th day of the second month, after they departed from the land of Egypt, So the name of the second month of the ecclesiastical year is spelled Iyar, which is typically pronounced Iyar. One of the first things we can deduce is exactly how many days the children of Israel had been traveling from the first day they started in the early hours of the 15th of Abib while it was still dark. Remember, they left Egypt on the 15th day of Abib, which was on Thursday. 2 days later, on the 17th of Abib, was the Saturday Sabbath. That was the weekly Sabbath after Passover during the days of unleavened bread. The next day, Sunday, the 18th of Abib, is the day of the wave sheaf offering and the beginning of the count to Pentecost. Counting weekly Sabbaths from the wave sheaf offering to the 15th day of the second Sabbath, from the wave sheaf offering to the 15th, from the 15th day of the second Sabbath of the second month brings us to the fourth weekly Sabbath, or 28 days counting to Pentecost. That puts us at 31 days of travel since they left Egypt on the 15th of Abib. In the case of my title, I am including Passover. Where I am including Passover, we are at day 32. I'm just adding an extra day to their travel time. When we start reading verse 2, remember this day is the Sabbath for us. Excuse me. So when we start reading in verse 2 of this chapter, remember this day is a Sabbath. For us today, the 15th of Iyar was last Sabbath. That was May 2nd of this year. Exodus 16, verse 2. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Skipping down to verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. At this point in time, God had been performing miracles and working with Israel. From what we saw in chapter 13, the indication is that they were pausing their travels each week for the Sabbath. We see in verse 1 of this chapter that they arrived on the 15th. From that context, they must have traveled on the 14th, and then at the end, so the 14th of this month of Iyar, the second month, and they must have traveled and then stopped to set up their camp just before sunset, which would be the 15th. The scriptures imply that many of the Israelites did not actually properly keep the Sabbaths. Now we're going to see where God asserts his authority with follow-up of the consequences for ignoring the Sabbath. In verse 5 of Exodus 16, and it shall be on the sixth day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Then Moses and Aaron said to the children of Israel, At evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your complaints against the Lord. But what are we that you complain against us? Notice there are two events that are going to happen. First, the first happened in the evening, and the second was to happen in the morning. So, verse 8, and also Moses said, This shall be seen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord hears your complaints which you make against him. What are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. Kind of relates to our sermonette. When you lodge complaints against God, we put ourselves at risk of inciting God's anger against us. Continuing in verse 9. Then Moses spoke to Aaron, Say to all the congregation of the children of Israel, Come near before the Lord, for he has heard your complaints. And now it came to pass, as Aaron spoke the whole congregation of the children of Israel, spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked towards the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. God was constantly demonstrating his power, and here in verse 10, he showed Israel a glimpse of his glory. The purpose was to instill fear that would help them realize the grave danger to even consider bringing accusations of judgment against Jehovah to be a small thing. Continuing in verse 11. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. Continuing in verse 16. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it according to each one's need, 1 omer for each person. According to the number of persons, let every man take for those who are in his tent. And the children of Israel did so, and gathered some more and some less. So when they measured it by omers, he who gathered much had nothing over, and he who had gathered little had no lack. Every man had gathered according to each one's needs. The context seems to indicate that no matter how much they gathered, each person ended up with the same amount. Verse 19, and Moses said, Let no one leave any of it till morning. Each person was allowed the same amount. Each person was allowed 1 omer of the bread that came down from heaven for each day. Even on this one thing, there were those that could or would not follow directions. They needed consequences to motivate them for self-control. In verse 20, God gives them consequences. Verse 20, Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses, but some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. So they gathered it every morning, every man according to his needs, and when the sun became hot, it melted. They did this every morning until the 6th day, then something changed. And so it was, verse 22, on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Seems to indicate they were surprised. The context here reinforces the idea that no matter what they gathered, they only ended up with their allotted amount. The difference on this day was that they miraculously ended up with double the daily amount. Continuing in verse 23, Then he said to them, this is Moses speaking, this is what the Lord has said, tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. In the context of comparing the timing of the events to our day, they would have received double yesterday, Friday, the 6th of the week before the Sabbath. It would be this Sabbath. Continuing in verse 24, so they laid it up until morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Then Moses said, Eat that today, for today is your Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th, which is the Sabbath, there will be none. Even after all the miracles and corrections, some of the people stubbornly refused and were determined to test God. Verse 27, Now it happened that the people went out on the 7th day to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath, therefore he gives you on the 6th day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. And the house of Israel called its name manna, and it was like white coriander seeds, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Now, I have a sweet tooth, and so I'm sure I would have enjoyed the manna, and I would have probably been very disappointed when it ended 40 years later. This story about manna is how we can determine for sure that the 7 months of the festival calendar for today has the holy days landing on the same days as they landed in the year of the Exodus. A week earlier, when Moses told the people that they would be getting quail in the evening and manna in the morning, he said they would be receiving manna for 6 days. As we see from the context, they received manna 6 days, and then on the 7th day, they did not receive the manna because it was the Sabbath. If you count backwards, 6 days from the Sabbath is Sunday, and the day before Sunday was the Sabbath. So the 15th of the week before was the Sabbath. On the 15th of Iyar, they arrived in the wilderness of Sin, probably in the evening shortly after sunset. The people complained to Moses. God intervened and spoke directly to Moses, informing him that there would be quail to eat that evening, and then in the morning they would receive bread for the next 6 days until the Sabbath. From this information, we see that the Sabbath prior to the first week of manna was Iyar 15. And all the other holy days, they all during that period of the ecclesiastical year, the months and the lengths of the months and everything are exactly the same. You can calculate every festival from that landmark. The Hebrew calendar is structured so that it only allows the 15th of Iyar to fall on either a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, or Saturday. On average, the 15th of Iyar, according to AI, Google AI, falls on the Sabbath approximately 2.7 times every 19-year cycle. The established 19-year cycles of the Hebrew calendar are called Metonic cycles, and they're important for calculating the civil calendar. I have already mentioned the holy days in the same weekday the holy days fall on the same weekdays of the year of the Exodus as this year, 2026, and AD 30 when Christ was crucified. It is also interesting to note that the same is true for the year of the flood. The holy days in the year of the flood would have landed on the same days of the week as for us this year. Turn to probably meaningless, but I thought it was very interesting. Turn to Exodus 17. As it was in the year of the Exodus, today is day 35 to the count of Pentecost. At this point in the time of the count of Israel had been traveling from Egypt was 38 days. As it was for them, so it is for us today. It is 2 weeks and a day to the day of Pentecost. So for us, it's 2 weeks. Jack was mentioning that in the announcements. Chapter 17 and verse 1. Then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin according to the commandments of the Lord and camped in Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" And the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it that you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." For the sake of context, they likely headed out from the wilderness of Sin the next day after the Sabbath. On that Sunday, before they headed out, God provided them with manna in the morning. This was the first day of the second week that God had miraculously provided them food. The most likely traveled They most likely traveled for at least a day or two and then started complaining about water. They were so angry with Moses that he was actually afraid that they were going to try to kill him. Again, God provided what they needed. What comes next seems surprising. Given the fact that God had just destroyed the most powerful military forces in the region, yet, as we will see in verse 8, someone thought they might successfully attack the children of Israel. Exodus 17, verse 8, now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. The next chapter is where Jethro arrives and advises Moses concerning resolutions of conflict. Jethro leaves and returns to his own land. For me, that was a very busy week. The next Sabbath brings us up to the last day of the second month, which is day number 45 for travel. Days, okay, so it'd be 42 days if we're counting from Pentecost, from the wave sheaf, and the next day will be the start of a new month, the first day of the month of Sivan. Chapter 19, verse 1. Chapter 19, verse 1. In the third month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. And you don't want to confuse this wilderness of Sinai with the Sinai Peninsula. They're different. For they had departed from Rephidim, had come to the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. So the indication is that day, the day they broke camp and left Rephidim, they arrived at the wilderness of Sinai and set up camp at the base of Mount Sinai. So it was a very short distance from Rephidim to Mount Sinai at the base. This is the place where God would give Israel the 10 Commandments and make a covenant with them. Continuing in verse 3. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. On Sunday, early in the day, they left Rephidim, traveled a portion of that day, and arrived at the base of Mount Sinai and set up camp. I don't know exactly how the events transpired for the next few days. A possible scenario is that they set up camp, and the next day, Monday, Moses met with God on the mountain. While Moses is on the mountain, God reveals to him the covenant that he intends to make with Israel. Tuesday, Moses returns to the camp and meets with the elders of the people and presents them God's proposal. The elders inform Moses that they accept. Wednesday, Moses returns to the mountain and informs God that the people accept the proposal. God gave Moses specific instructions for the people to prepare themselves, and for Moses to sanctify them. So the people washed their clothes and prepared themselves for 3 days. The end of the week was the end of the count of 7 Sabbaths. The date was the 7th of Sivan. In 2 weeks, we will be keeping the Sabbath, and it will be the 7th of Sivan. The next day will be the 50th day of the month of the wave, 50th, of the wave sheaf, the 8th day of Sivan. For Israel, in the year of the Exodus, they were at their 53rd day of traveling out of Egypt. And considering my title, when I added the extra day to include Passover, 54 days of the Exodus. As I was preparing this message, I was surprised to see how the scriptures reinforced and substantiated the Hebrew calendar. In the past, I had been led to believe that the Hebrew calendar could not be proven through the scriptures. A couple years ago, I was surprised when I discovered that the record of scripture concerning Noah's flood matched the record of the Hebrew calendar, and that record substantiated the legitimacy of the postponements. The Old Testament of the Christian Bible is a slightly reorganized version of the Hebrew Bible. They both contain the same information. Pairing the Hebrew Bible with the Hebrew calendar with the Hebrew Bible complements two sources of information that help us make sense of the scriptures and God's intentions and reasons for what he has done. The Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew calendar fit together like hand and glove. The Hebrew calendar unites us. Ignoring the Hebrew calendar for alternative calendars divides us.